They called it Deathwood, a forest so cursed, even the wind forgot how to whisper inside it. But when a wounded girl appeared beneath its ancient pines, guarded by a ghost-black stallion, 3 strangers were pulled into a journey that would uncover lost bloodlines, a hidden treasure, and a truth far more dangerous than any curse. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of what we choose to remember, and what the land refuses to let us forget. They say the forest doesn't remember names, only screams. Before the wars, before the gold rush, before men drew borders across the skin of the earth, there was a stretch of pine-laced wilderness whispered of in fear and reverence alike. Locals called it Deathwood, but no one could tell you why, or rather, too many could, each tale darker than the last. It was a place where compasses spun wild and time seemed to sag like wet cloth. Some swore the trees moved when you weren't looking. Others claimed you could hear breathing, low, rhythmic, ancient, beneath the moss. But the truth was always worse than the stories. Deathwood didn't need to be haunted. It was simply patient. Elias Kane had lived on the forest's edge for 2 decades, and if you asked anyone in the nearby settlements, they'd tell you he was as much a part of that land as the frost or the wind. Broad-shouldered and silent as snowfall, Elias didn't trade in words. He traded in furs, meat, scars, and warnings. The only company he kept was his 16-year-old son Jonah, a boy wiry and fast, all restless limbs and searching eyes. Together they lived in a hand-built cabin, wood smoke-stained and weather-worn, nestled where the wild pressed hardest against the edge of the known world. Their life was stitched from the raw fabric of survival. Mornings broke with the howl of wind through bare trees, days filled with tracking elk, trapping fox, hauling fresh water through knee-deep snow. Elias had rules, hard rules: never waste bullets, never follow blood too far, and above all, never step into Deathwood. But of course, warnings are merely dares wrapped in fear. The forest loomed like a secret too heavy to carry. Jonah had grown up hearing its name hissed through teeth by traders, by drunkards, by men who never quite returned the same. Some spoke of gold buried deep beneath its roots, some of ghost lights flickering between trunks at night. Some said it was cursed by the spirits of those betrayed. Native, outlaw, soldier alike, souls swallowed by hunger or hate. But Elias never entertained such talk. "The forest isn't cursed," he told Jonah once, voice like gravel on steel. "It's just older than us, and smarter." But that didn't explain the bones. Jonah had found them when he was 9, half buried beneath a fallen pine, the skull grinning up through layers of wet moss. Elias never said a word, just reburied them deeper. After that, the boy stopped asking questions. But he never stopped watching. As years passed, Jonah grew into the shape of a man, though the world had yet to test its weight. He could skin a deer in under 10 minutes, snare a rabbit with string and instinct. But in his heart bloomed something Elias couldn't trap or gut: curiosity. Not the childish kind, but the burning kind. The kind that turns into obsession. The kind that lures you to the edge of known maps and whispers, "Step forward." One morning, just as dawn was smearing pink across the snow, that whisper became a roar. They found the first trail near the stream, fresh blood in the powder, thick and crimson. Not deer, too heavy, too deliberate. Elias examined the tracks. "Grizzly," he muttered, "wounded, desperate." His face tightened. Tracking a wounded bear was suicide. They both knew it. But Elias, for reasons he wouldn't voice, started forward. The deeper they walked, the quieter the world became. Birds vanished. Wind slowed. The air itself seemed reluctant to follow. trees pressed close together like they were eavesdropping. Jonah's heart pounded, not with fear, not yet, but with something older, something inherited. The kind of dread born not of danger but of recognition. They crossed the invisible line. There was no sign, no marker, no sudden shift in the landscape. Just a moment, one footstep, where everything changed. The light grew dimmer, though the sky was clear. Shadows stretched too long. Every sound echoed strangely, like it had been caught in a tunnel. And still, Elias pressed forward, jaw clenched. They found her beneath a pine that must have been older than memory. She lay motionless, half buried in snow, her dark hair fanned across the frozen earth like ink spilled in winter. No coat, no boots, just a thin tunic clinging to trembling limbs. And beside her, hoof prints the size of dinner plates circling protectively. A black stallion stood guard, muscles twitching beneath a coat that shimmered with sweat and ice. He did not bolt, he did not flinch. He simply watched, his eyes glowing like twin embers in the gloom. Elias raised his rifle. The stallion didn't move. "She's breathing," Jonah said, kneeling quickly. Her lips were blue, but her pulse fluttered beneath his fingers like a trapped bird. She looked too young to be alone, too fragile to have survived this deep. And yet, somehow she had. As Elias knelt beside them, he noticed something else. Symbols etched faintly into the skin of her arms. Old, tribal, sacred. "We can't leave her here," Jonah whispered. Elias didn't answer. He just lifted her gently, eyes darting once more to the stallion, who, after a long pause, followed. That night, as fire cracked and wind howled beyond the log walls of their cabin, the girl woke. Her eyes opened slowly, then all at once, sharp as eagle's wings slicing air. She didn't speak, not yet. But in that silence something passed between them. Not fear, not gratitude, something stranger. A recognition that none of them could name yet. Jonah couldn't sleep. He sat near the hearth, watching her from across the room, heart pounding, not with infatuation but with wonder. Who was she? What had she run from? Why had the forest spared her when it had swallowed so many others? He didn't know it yet. But in that moment, watching a stranger breathe against the weight of 1,000 trees, his world began to unravel. Or maybe it was beginning to rebuild. Because not all legends start with thunder. Some begin with a single step into the dark. The fire had burned low when she finally spoke. Her voice was rough at first, dry as pine bark, but underneath it there was steel. She didn't ask where she was or who they were. She only asked one question. Did he make it? Neither Elias nor Jonah knew who he was, but the weight in her voice silenced any questions of their own. Elias stirred the embers with a poker and handed her a tin cup of warm water. She drank slowly, wincing at every swallow, but her gaze never left his face. Jonah sat across from her, pretending to occupy himself with sharpening his knife, though his eyes kept flicking back toward the girl whose very presence had shifted the air in their home. Her name was Ayoka. In the language of her people it meant she brought happiness, though nothing in her eyes spoke of joy. There was something old in her, something carried from a place deeper than time. As the fire crackled and the wind moaned outside like a dying thing, she told her story, piece by piece. Her tribe had lived along the river plains for generations, guardians of sacred lands that held both legend and memory. They had no cavalry, no walls, only stories and honor and the land itself. And yet that had been enough, until it wasn't. One night, long after the last bird had gone quiet, a rival band descended like wolves. Not for land, not for revenge, but for blood. Ayoka's grandfather, the tribal chief, had hidden her beneath a hollow of stones before drawing his knife and vanishing into the darkness. The only other soul who stayed behind was her horse, Shadowhoof, a beast born from midnight and thunder. He found her, buried her scent, shielded her with his body, and when all was lost, he carried her away. She had no memory of the ride, only that her eyes opened beside the frozen lake, her limbs numb, her lungs aching, and her horse still standing over her like a monument to survival. Jonah couldn't look away. Every word she spoke reshaped his world. It was as if someone had ripped open the seams of everything he thought he understood about the frontier. His father had told him stories about settlers, bandits, the hunger of gold, the fire of gunpowder, but never this, never the kind of pain that wore feathers and sang in a dying language. Elias listened with a stillness that bordered on reverence. He'd seen violence, fought his own wars. But what this girl described wasn't a raid, it was an erasure, a cleansing. And there was no law that would punish the men who'd done it, no cavalry coming, no justice waiting just beyond the next hill. The silence after her tale stretched long and thin. The only sound was the crackle of sap in the logs. "We should bury them," Ahyoka said at last, eyes glowing like coals. "All of them. But I will settle for surviving them." Elias nodded once. That was the closest he came to a vow. In the days that followed, she healed slowly. Her ribs were bruised, and a thin line of purple ran along her jaw where a rifle butt had caught her. But she moved like a predator, careful, graceful, always aware. Elias showed her how to set snares along the southern ridge. Jonah taught her how to skim ice off the stream for clean water. In return, she taught them both something deeper than any frontier skill. She taught them to see, not just the land, but the meaning inside it. Trees that bent toward the sun in morning. Rocks carved by forgotten hands. Places where voices used to sing, where feet once danced, where spirits still listened. Jonah followed her on quiet walks into the edge of Deathwood. Not deep, never far, but enough to learn that the forest was not silent. It was simply waiting for someone who knew how to hear. One night, as snow whispered against the window panes, Jonah found himself beside her again by the fire. Elias had gone to check the traps, leaving them in the quiet glow. "Do you believe in fate?" Jonah asked, half afraid of the answer. Ahyoka didn't smile. She rarely did, but her expression softened just slightly. "I believe the land remembers," she said, "even when people forget. Sometimes it calls souls together, not for their comfort, but because something must be done, something only they can do." Jonah nodded, though he didn't fully understand. Not yet. But he felt it, the stirrings of something enormous moving beneath their feet, a current pulling them toward a place they could not name. It was around that fire that trust began to grow, not from shared laughter, but from shared silence. Elias, who had once lived like a lone wolf, began to speak more. He told stories of his youth, of a wife buried on a hillside now lost to pine, of mistakes carved into the flesh of his memory. Ahyoka listened without judgment. Jonah began to feel less like a boy, more like a bridge between two worlds. His father's past, her people's loss, and something new neither of them could yet name. But even as the cabin warmed with quiet camaraderie, the world beyond its walls chilled with danger. Tracks were found near the edge of the wood, not animal, but men. Torches had scorched the snow in strange patterns. A tree was found stripped of bark, carved with a warning in a language neither Elias nor Jonah could read, but Ahyoka could. "They're close," she said, her voice steady. "They've followed the stallion's prints, maybe even mine." Elias loaded the rifle without a word. "Jonah," checked the traps, reinforced the door, counted the ammunition. No one spoke of what might happen. No one needed to. Something ancient had been awakened. And as the forest closed in once more, as wind howled through the eaves and the trees stood taller than ever, the cabin no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a drum, waiting for the first strike. The first sign was the smell, burnt oil and old leather carried by the wind. It slipped through the cracks in the walls and settled into the wood like smoke before the fire ever showed itself. Jonah caught it first, sitting up from where he'd been half dozing near the door. The snow outside reflected nothing. No moon, no stars. Just the kind of darkness that seemed to pull your breath from your chest. Then came the sound. Soft crunches in the snow, slow and deliberate. Too even to be animals. Too many to be safe. Elias moved before Jonah could speak. He was already pulling his rifle from the mantel, loading it with practiced calm. He didn't ask questions, he didn't need to. His eyes met Jonah's, and something passed between them. Unspoken, sharp, final. A father preparing his son not just to fight, but to become something more than he was the moment before. Ahyoka didn't ask what was happening. She didn't flinch. She slipped the bone-handled knife from her belt and stood near the window, her silhouette framed in firelight. Her eyes were steady, but Jonah saw the tension in her jaw, the way her shoulders squared as if bracing for an old, familiar storm. They had come for her. It wasn't justice or vengeance that guided the men who now circled the cabin. It was erasure. A cruel insistence that she not only vanish, but be forgotten. That the stories of her people go silent forever. And standing in their way was a trapper with a half-healed wound, a teenage boy who'd never fired a gun at a man, and a girl whose only weapon was memory, and the blade of her ancestors. The first torch flared just beyond the tree line. Then another. Flames moving through the snow like the eyes of wolves circling. Elias opened the door first, stepped into the cold like a man greeting death with a handshake. He didn't shout, he didn't warn. He simply raised the rifle to his shoulder and waited. Jonah's heart was a hammer in his chest. Not fear, not quite, but something heavier. Something that knew a line was about to be crossed and could never be uncrossed. He took his place by the front window, shotgun in hand, fingers trembling. The men came fast. No parley, no threats, just a sudden charge, loud and brutal. The forest erupted with snarls and gunfire. Elias's rifle roared once, twice, each shot precise, controlled. He moved like a machine powered by principle. Jonah fired wildly, not aiming so much as defending space, time, breath. Ahyoka slipped out the back, disappearing into the trees like wind. Jonah didn't see her go. He only realized she was gone when he turned to call out and found the room empty of her presence. The fight spilled beyond the cabin. Jonah followed the retreating steps of a man he'd wounded, catching up just as the figure turned with a blade. There was no time to think, only act. The shotgun dropped. Jonah ducked. The knife sliced air. He tackled the man into the snow and wrestled for the weapon, his fingers raw and bleeding before he finally pinned the stranger's wrist and forced the knife from his hand. When it was over, Jonah stood above the man, panting, staring down at what he'd done. He hadn't killed him, but he could have. And the thought terrified him more than the blood on his hands. The forest around him was alive with echoes, shouts, running feet, distant gunshots. Somewhere to his left, he heard the familiar bark of his father's rifle, and then a scream, not fear, not pain, but fury, Ahyoka. Jonah ran toward it, instincts guiding him better than sight. He found her near the southern ridge, engaged in a silent dance with a man twice her size. Her blade moved in arcs, smooth and certain. The man swung wildly, rage blinding him. Jonah lifted a rock from the snow and threw it with everything he had. It struck the man in the shoulder, staggering him for just a heartbeat, enough for Ahyoka to step in and bury the blade into his thigh. He fell hard, screaming now in pain that no rage could smother. She didn't finish him. She turned to Jonah, eyes wide, not with fear, but urgency. "They'll burn the cabin," she said. "They don't want to kill, they want to erase." They made it back just as Elias staggered out, his left arm soaked in red. A gash ran from shoulder to elbow, deep and ugly. But he was still standing. The cabin behind him smoked, embers licking the corners. One torch had found its mark, but the snow had slowed the fire's hunger. Still, it would not stand another night. They couldn't stay. By morning, the attackers were gone, either fled or buried. The snow bore the stories of the night in streaks of crimson and ash. The wind had died down, as if satisfied by the offering. They buried the dead with their weapons, an old tradition Elias insisted on, even for men who'd meant to kill them. "A man dies as he lived," he said. "Let the earth judge him now." As they stood over the last grave, Ahyoka reached into her satchel and drew out something wrapped in tanned hide. She had kept it hidden, even from them. Not out of mistrust, but necessity. A map, old, worn, ink faded at the edges. "This is why they came," she said softly. "Not just for me, for this. They think it leads to gold buried deep in the forest, the Deathwood, but they don't know what it costs to seek it." Elias studied the parchment. "You believe it's real?" Ahyoka nodded. "My grandfather believed. His father before him, but not for riches, for what was lost, for what still rests beneath the trees." Jonah felt something shift in the air around them, like the forest itself had paused, listening. He stepped closer. "Then we follow it." Elias looked at his son, really looked, and saw not a boy, but someone forged in fire and shadow. He gave a single nod. And just like that, the three of them, scarred, hunted, bound by more than chance, turned their backs on the ashes of the only home they'd known and stepped into the darkness. Not away from danger, but toward something deeper, toward truth. The path ahead was not marked by signs or symbols, only by the weight of stories passed through generations and the hush of a forest too old to care about time. With the map pressed between Ahyoka's palms and the sky above dimming into a deep, haunting gray, they crossed deeper into Deathwood, past the point where even the bravest hunters turned back, past the bones of trails long forgotten. Jonah felt it first, the way the forest changed as they moved. The air became heavier, almost thick with intention, as if they were being watched not with eyes but with memory. Trees grew closer together, not wild but purposeful, like guardians protecting something sacred and unforgiving. Ahyoka walked at the front, her every movement deliberate. She didn't follow the map blindly. She read the land, let it speak to her in a language no white man ever bothered to understand. The tilt of stones, the echo of birdsong, or the sudden lack of it. Everything meant something here. Elias kept his rifle close, but his thoughts were further away. This was a man who had fought beasts, men, weather, and time. But none of those things demanded respect the way this forest did. There was no arrogance in him now, only reverence. He understood something few would admit. Deathwood didn't kill because it was cursed. It killed because it remembered. For days they moved through mist and shadow. They slept in silence, taking turns on watch, cooking what they caught over fires too small to announce their presence. Sometimes Jonah would ask questions about Ahyoka's tribe, the stories behind the symbols etched in the trees. The reason her grandfather believed the treasure must never be taken only understood. Ahyoka would answer, not with facts, but with meaning. She explained how the treasure was a burden carried by spirits, loot buried by outlaws who died in fear and left behind more than gold. She believed the forest held that weight because no one else would. But Jonah, still young, still wrestling with wonder and purpose, couldn't help but feel the pull of adventure. The idea of treasure, it gleamed in the back of his mind like a promise. He told himself it wasn't greed, but justice. Didn't the poor deserve help? Couldn't they take it and do good? He kept those thoughts mostly to himself, though sometimes Elias caught his gaze lingering too long on the map, or on Ahyoka when she wasn't looking. On the 5th day, they reached the first sign, the stone faces. 3 towering carvings, eroded by centuries of rain and moss, stared out from a cliffside. Their features were distorted, mouths open in either song or warning. Ahyoka bowed before them, whispering in her tongue. Elias removed his hat. Jonah just stood still, breath caught in his throat. The air here buzzed with something he couldn't name. Below the cliff was a ravine they needed to cross. The bridge, or what was left of it, hung like a thread between two worlds. Rotted ropes, planks swallowed by lichen, nothing sturdy enough to trust. But there was no other way. One by one they crossed. Jonah nearly slipped once, caught by Elias's hand. The moment reminded him how fragile this journey really was, how easily everything could end with one misstep. Beyond the ravine, the forest grew stranger. Trees with twisted trunks that curved toward the east, stones piled in circles, untouched by human hands, and whispers, real or imagined, none of them could tell. Once, they heard something screaming in the night. It wasn't animal, it wasn't man, it was grief, maybe, a memory too loud to stay buried. Then came the ambush. Bandits. Scarred men with eyes like starving dogs. Not the ones from the cabin, they were different. Desperate, half-mad, perhaps once hunters of the same treasure. Now reduced to shadows, clinging to rumors for survival. They wanted the map, nothing else. The fight was swift and brutal. Elias's shot echoed through the trees. Jonah, more sure now, handled his weapon with precision. Ahyoka fought not with rage, but with precision. Every move a tribute to the warriors she'd lost. When it ended, they left the bodies behind, unburied. Ahyoka's voice was quiet as they walked on. Some places do not forgive trespass. Some deaths do not deserve rest. 2 days later, they found the cavern. It was not what Jonah expected. No grand entrance, no golden glow. Just a narrow crack in the earth beneath a ridge where the sun never touched. Inside, it was cold and damp, and the walls shimmered with minerals that reflected the torchlight like veins of ghostly fire. As they moved deeper, the passage widened into a chamber that seemed to pulse with silence. There it was, the treasure. Not piled high like in the storybooks, but carefully arranged. Coins stacked, jewelry laid out in patterns. Weapons rested against the stone as if placed in reverence. A king's ransom, yes. Enough to buy land, armies, influence. But that wasn't what caught their breath. It was the bones, lining the chamber like sentinels, some still in armor, some with remnants of tribal wear, some in plain settler clothes. A gallery of greed. They had come here for riches and never left. The treasure had not been cursed by spirits. It had been watched. And when the wrong hands reached, the forest had judged. Elias said nothing for a long time. Then he set his rifle down and walked to the center of the room. He knelt. Not to pray, to think. "We could take it," Jonah said, almost to himself. "Just a part, enough to help people." Ahyoka didn't answer at first. She touched a ring near the bones of a child. It was carved with symbols of her people, stolen likely in blood. "We don't take it," she said. "We return it." It was Elias who spoke next. "What if we gave it away, quietly, piece by piece, to the ones who've lost everything, not for power, for peace?" Jonah looked at both of them, something tightening in his chest. This wasn't the ending he'd imagined, but maybe it was the one that mattered. They made a pact there, beneath the earth. Not to claim, not to profit, but to deliver. One coin at a time. One act of hope in a land too often shaped by violence. The forest, once a legend of fear, would become a place where something was finally given back. And so they began their second journey. Not toward riches, but toward redemption. They didn't return the way they came. There was no ceremony in their exit, no grand farewell to the chamber of bones and gold. They left the cavern in silence, each step backward heavier than any they had taken forward. The pact they had made beneath the earth wasn't bound by oath or ritual. It was sealed in the understanding that not all treasures are meant to be claimed. Some, like the ghosts that guard them, are meant to be released. And so began a quieter kind of journey, one not driven by the thrill of discovery, but by the slow, deliberate labor of restoration. Over the weeks that followed, Elias, Ahyoka, and Jonah carried small pieces of the hoard out of Deathwood, always by night, always with care. They moved through the outskirts of frontier towns, their presence as silent as snowfall. A pouch of coins left on a widow's doorstep. A silver brooch slipped into the hand of a sick child's mother. A stack of old gold bars buried at the foot of a burned church, with a note that simply read, "Rebuild." The people who received these gifts never saw where they came from. Some thought them miracles. Others thought them tricks. But the ones who needed hope the most accepted them with open hands and open hearts. Slowly, Deathwood's curse began to shift in the stories people told. No longer a place of evil or death, it became the source of a new myth, one whispered across the plains, from wagon to campfire. They called it the forest that gives. None knew who was behind it. The three travelers never stayed long enough to be remembered. Elias kept to the background, eyes always scanning, jaw always set. Jonah began to grow taller beneath the weight of quiet purpose. He no longer asked about keeping part of the treasure. He no longer looked at the map with wonder in his eyes. He'd learned, in the dark of that cavern, that some gold cost more than any man could pay. And Ahyoka, so she was not simply a survivor anymore. She became something more. A storyteller. A guide. In the small settlements where they stayed long enough to warm their hands, she would share tales by firelight. Her voice soft, her gaze fierce. She didn't speak of the treasure. She spoke of rivers that healed, of warriors who walked into death with open arms, of lands that remember when people forget. She spoke to children who had never heard the rhythm of her language before, and some of them listened. After months, Elias decided it was time to stop. Not because the work was done, it never would be, but because he knew the road ahead belonged to the younger ones. He found a quiet town nestled against the curve of a hill and built a small cabin with his own hands. He didn't say much when he told Jonah and Ahyoka his decision. Just a nod, a passing of the torch without the need for fire. Jonah hugged him for the first time in years. Elias didn't let go right away. From there, the two younger companions traveled alone, following the old trade roads, moving like shadows through the shifting landscape. They never called themselves anything. They weren't saviors or saints. They were simply two people trying to make wrong things a little more right. In one town, they gave enough silver to reopen a mill that had burned the winter before. In another, they bought medicine for a frontier doctor who hadn't been paid in a year. They never stayed for thanks. they simply disappeared. The legend grew behind them like smoke from a fire already put out. People began to claim they had seen the trapper, the boy, and the native girl in far-flung corners of the West. Some swore they were spirits. Others claimed they were the last true outlaws, but the kind who robbed only darkness. The truth, as always, was stranger and simpler. They had chosen not to possess the treasure, but to become it. And Deathwood? It changed, as much as a forest can. With the weight of greed lifted from its roots, it returned to silence, but a different kind. Not haunted, not hostile, just quiet. Travelers still avoided its deepest heart, but they no longer spoke of it in hushed curses. Instead, they spoke of the girl who vanished into its trees and emerged carrying something more powerful than gold, a second chance. Years passed, stories changed. Jonah eventually returned to Deathwood alone. Not to seek, not to bury, but to remember. He walked the old paths, now softened by time, and listened. The forest didn't speak to him, not with words, but he felt it. That same presence from years ago, not watching, not waiting, just being. He knelt beside the lake where they had first found her. He didn't say her name aloud, he didn't need to. Far away, Ahyoka taught children of all bloodlines in a school built from the bones of an old trading post. She taught them songs and stories and silence. She never spoke of the gold. But when they asked why she wore a knife with ancient symbols on her hip, she would smile and say, "It's a gift from someone who believed in what's possible." Elias passed away in his sleep beneath a sky heavy with snow. Jonah buried him with the same calm reverence his father had always carried. No stone, just a wooden marker and the rifle laid across it. Ahyoka arrived days later, and they stood together for a long time, saying nothing. Because sometimes silence is enough. And so the story ends, not with a bang, not with a shot or a treasure found, but with a whisper passed between generations. A story of a forest once feared, of a girl who defied death, a boy who learned what it meant to become a man, and a father who gave more than he ever asked for in return. Some say they still ride together, when the wind shifts through the trees just right. Others say the forest keeps their footprints beneath the moss, so it never forgets. But those who know, truly know, understand that the real curse was never the forest. It was forgetting that hope could grow even in the darkest places. And in Deathwood, hope did not just survive, it was planted, it was nurtured, and it thrived. In the vast, untamed silence of the American frontier, where the laws of man often failed to reach and the land spoke in its own language of wind, snow, and ancient memory, there lived a man named Elias Cain, his son Jonah, and a young woman named Ahyoka, whose blood carried the weight of generations. Their story, born in the shadow of Deathwood, a place feared, misunderstood, and steeped in myth, is not merely a tale of survival or treasure. It is a tale of awakening, of transformation, and of redemption. It began with a wounded girl found near the frozen heart of a cursed forest, guarded by a wild stallion and pursued by death. She was not just a refugee, she was the last hope of a forgotten people, carrying knowledge and pain that the world had tried to erase. And in the kindness of strangers, two men who could have turned away but didn't, she found more than safety. She found purpose. Together, Elias, Jonah, and Ahyoka faced a world that demanded blood for peace and silence for justice. They survived an attack meant to silence her forever, fought back with grit and fire, and then, against all odds, followed a map inked in legend and sorrow deep into the belly of Deathwood. There, they uncovered what so many had died seeking, a vast treasure buried not just beneath earth but beneath centuries of greed, betrayal, and forgotten names. But, unlike those who had come before them, they did not see gold. They saw burden, they saw stories, they saw blood, and they made a choice. They would not take it, they would not sell it, they would redeem it. Piece by piece, they returned what was stolen, not to its original owners, for many of them were gone, but to the spirit of justice itself. They gave anonymously to the broken, the lost, the desperate. Their hands carried gold, but their hearts carried something more powerful, the willingness to give without being known, to heal without being praised. In the process, each of them changed. Elias, the hardened trapper who had once chosen solitude over sorrow, found peace in purpose. He learned to speak again, not just with words, but with action, with legacy. Jonah, the restless boy full of questions and youthful hunger, grew into a man who understood that heroism isn't about glory. It's about restraint. It's about protecting what matters, even if no one ever thanks you for it. And Ahyoka, fierce, rooted, and unyielding, emerged not just as a survivor, but as a teacher, a voice, a flame that would light paths for generations who had never known their stories were worth telling. The forest changed too. Deathwood, once feared, became sacred again. Not because it was tamed or explained, but because it was respected. It no longer needed to protect the gold. It could breathe, it could rest. In time, the story of the trapper, his son, and the chief's granddaughter spread, not in newspapers or town records, but in whispers, in legends passed from father to son, mother to daughter. No one remembered their names, but everyone remembered the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there were still people in the world who did the right thing, not for reward, but because it was right. And that, dear listener, is where the true power of this story lies. Because in a world still haunted by greed, still torn by violence, still learning how to heal from its own history, we need stories like this more than ever. We need reminders that hope isn't just something you find, it's something you choose, over and over again. So what is the lesson of Deathwood? It is this. Sometimes the greatest treasure we'll ever discover is not something buried beneath the earth, but something buried within ourselves. The ability to care, to act, to remember, to give. In our own lives, we may never face cursed forests or ancient maps, but we will face decisions, opportunities to help others without recognition, moments where we must decide whether to take the easy path or the just one. We will encounter people like Ahyoka, people with stories we don't yet understand, carrying pain we've never felt. And when we do, we must ask ourselves, will we turn away, or will we make space for healing? This story teaches us that legacy is not what we take. It's what we leave behind. You don't have to be a trapper, a warrior, or a hero to change the world. Sometimes, all it takes is one act of quiet courage, one refusal to follow the path of greed, one willingness to listen, to help, to remember. So the next time you're tempted to believe that your choices don't matter, think of Deathwood. Think of Elias, who could have walked away from a girl in the snow. Think of Jonah, who learned that courage isn't about being fearless, but about acting in spite of fear. Think of Ahyoka, who carried the voices of her ancestors not as a burden, but as a banner. And remember, the curse was never the forest. The curse was forgetting that we belong to one another. Thank you for joining us on this journey through myth, memory, and meaning. If this story moved you, inspired you, or gave you something to think about, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us keep these stories alive and gives us the strength to keep digging deeper into the forgotten legends of the American West and beyond. There are more tales waiting to be told, more voices that deserve to be heard, so stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that changes you.